Hello, my friends. Welcome back to World History English. Today's story is about Elizabeth Tudor, a girl who lost almost everything before she gained everything. In 1533, at Greenwich Palace, a baby girl was born to King Henry VIII of England. Henry had power, wealth, and an entire kingdom at his command. But there was one thing he wanted, more than anything else: a son. Gao's son meant the future of the dynasty, a guaranteed heir, a guaranteed legacy. Elizabeth was not that son, and in a world built around male succession, that made her, in the eyes of many, less valuable from the moment she took her first breath. No one in that room could have imagined what she would become. Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn, sharp, ambitious, and unlike anyone else at court. She hadn't been born into royalty. She had earned the king's obsession through wit and sheer force of personality. Henry was so consumed by her that he broke England away from the Catholic Church just to make her his wife, an entire nation reshaped for one woman's hand. But royal love was never separate from royal power. When Anne failed to produce a son, the tide turned fast. Accusations appeared, plots formed around her, and within 3 years of marrying the king, Anne Boleyn was executed. Elizabeth was 2 years old, too young to understand what death meant, old enough to feel that her world had shattered. The mother who once shielded her was gone. The family that once celebrated her had turned away. From that moment, Elizabeth stopped being a princess the court adored. She became a child the court preferred to forget. But those lonely years shaped her more than any privilege ever could. Losing everything taught her not to depend on anyone. It taught her to watch quietly before trusting. It taught her above all how to survive. That lesson had only just begun. After her mother's execution, Elizabeth didn't just lose a parent. She lost her place in the world she was born into. In the royal court of 16th century England, blood alone rarely protected anyone. Power decided everything. Henry VIII remarried quickly, still chasing his son. Eventually he got one, Edward, a legitimate male heir. To the king, Edward was the future. To the court, Elizabeth's position grew even shakier. She was formally declared illegitimate, a child from a marriage the crown no longer recognized. Imagine being born in a palace, carrying royal blood, and having your entire identity stripped away by a single political decision. That was Elizabeth's reality. Yet instead of breaking under it, she adapted. She had no army, no faction, no official title to fight with. What she had was her mind, and she sharpened it relentlessly. While most girls of her era were trained to become obedient wives, Elizabeth studied Latin, French, Italian, history, and philosophy, subjects many powerful men of the time never touched. Her tutors noticed her extraordinary memory and her habit of questioning everything, but what set her apart wasn't just intelligence. It was self-control. She learned to mask her emotions, to listen far more than she spoke, to study people before trusting them, skills that would later save her life. In 1547, Henry VIII died, and the crown passed to young Edward VI. Elizabeth was still a teenager, but she was beginning to understand something crucial. The throne wasn't just a symbol of power. It was the most dangerous seat in the country. Anyone connected to it became a target. As Edward's health declined, one question loomed over the entire kingdom: who comes next? And once again, Elizabeth, despite having no official claim, was pulled into the fight simply for being Henry's daughter. She never rushed. She understood that one mistake could cost her life. So she waited. She watched. She stayed silent. This was the first great lesson of her life. In a world full of enemies, sometimes the smartest move is letting people underestimate you. When Edward died, the crown didn't go to Elizabeth. It went to her half-sister, Mary Tudor, a devout queen who would come to see Elizabeth not as a sister, but as a threat capable of stealing her throne. That's when the real fight for survival began, because within a few years Elizabeth would be arrested, accused of treason, and taken to the most feared place in England, the Tower of London. For centuries, the Tower of London wasn't just a fortress. It was a symbol of power and of terror. Its cold stone walls had swallowed enemies of the crown, people who entered with noble titles, and never walked back out. In 1554, Elizabeth Tudor passed through those same gates. Her princess, a potential heir, and possibly a prisoner about to lose her life. Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry's first wife, believed she was the only rightful heir to the throne. Elizabeth's existence complicated everything. She carried royal blood. She was sharp and she had supporters. To Mary, that made Elizabeth dangerous. The kingdom was also splitting along religious lines. Mary was a devoted Catholic, determined to bring England back under Rome. Elizabeth had ties to the Protestant movement. To many, she wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a symbol of change. And in politics, a symbol can be more dangerous than an army. In 1554, a rebellion broke out against Queen Mary. Elizabeth hadn't led it, but her name was tangled in the rumors. Many believed that if Mary fell, Elizabeth would be next on the throne. Mary couldn't ignore that. Elizabeth was summoned for questioning. Knowing one wrong answer could end her life, she drew on everything she had learned: composure, sharp thinking, the discipline to hide fear. She never lost her temper, never overreacted. She understood that in a room full of enemies, survival doesn't always favor the strongest. It favors whoever controls themselves best. It wasn't enough to fully convince Mary. Elizabeth was sent to the Tower. Walking through those gates, Elizabeth knew she might never leave. She had watched this exact story play out before. Her mother had entered a place like this and never returned. History seemed ready to repeat itself, but in her darkest days, Elizabeth showed what made her different. She didn't collapse. She didn't panic. She kept reading, kept thinking, kept waiting, determined to prove she wasn't. A rebel wasn't a threat, just a woman trying to survive. Legend says that during her imprisonment, she carved words into a wall. Much suspected. By me, nothing proved can be. Whether or not the story is entirely accurate, it captures her spirit perfectly. In the game of power, the truth alone isn't always enough to save you, but wisdom can be. Eventually, Mary released her. Elizabeth remained watched, suspected, and in constant danger. But those months in the Tower had changed her forever. She now understood how power truly worked, and that becoming queen would take more than royal blood. It would take the patience of a survivor. Her fortune was about to turn. A sudden death was coming, one that would open the door. She'd spent her whole life being denied. November 17th, 1558, Queen Mary, I was dead. The crown passed to Elizabeth Tudor. The girl, once declared illegitimate, once stripped of her succession rights, once sitting in a prison cell awaiting her fate. She was 25 years old. On her shoulders now rested not just a crown, but the future of a deeply divided nation. England in 1558 wasn't the powerhouse it would later become. Religious division ran deep. The economy was weak. The military lacked strength. Rival powers across Europe waited for the young queen to stumble. To many, Elizabeth was an unlikely choice. Young, unmarried, with no husband to lean on, and no son to secure the line. In the eyes of the 16th century, an unmarried female ruler was inherently suspect. But Elizabeth wasn't trying to prove she could rule like a king. She was determined to prove she could rule as herself. From day one, she understood that power isn't only granted by a crown, it's shaped by how others perceive you. So she built her image deliberately. Not the wounded girl from her youth, not Mary's overshadowed sister, but a monarch who was calm, formidable, and impossible to control. She famously declared that she was married to England itself. It wasn't just a poetic line, it was strategy. Marrying a foreign prince risked handing away real power, and could drag England into wars it never chose. So Elizabeth made a bold decision early on. No man would stand above her. But holding the throne was only the beginning. Almost immediately threats emerged, including from within her own family. Mary, Queen of Scots, also carried Tudor blood, and many Catholics held a more legitimate claim to the English throne. That made Elizabeth the target of constant plots. If she failed, she risked not just her crown but her life, just like her mother before her. What Elizabeth had that few rivals possessed was hard-earned experience in survival. She had been the abandoned child, the suspect, the prisoner. Those years taught her to master fear rather than be ruled by it. She listened. She observed. She thought before she acted. While many rulers of her era relied on force to prove authority, Elizabeth relied on intellect. Her early reign was a relentless test. Rebuild trust, stabilize the country, balance warring. Religious factions. One wrong move could plunge the kingdom into civil war. Yet Elizabeth managed something few could. She made her fiercest enemies wait. She never let emotion steer policy. She turned patience into a weapon. But her greatest test hadn't arrived yet. Beyond England's shores, a mighty empire was watching her every move. A power with the strongest navy in Europe, convinced she had no right to the throne at all. They were preparing for a confrontation that would change history. Its name was Spain. 1588, when a massive fleet set sail toward England, a naval force many believed unbeatable, the Spanish Armada. Behind it stood King Philip II of Spain, who once envisioned bringing England back under his control. Years earlier, Elizabeth and Spain hadn't been enemies. Spain had even considered cooperation with her early on, but everything shifted over time, largely over religion. Spain stood at the heart of Catholic Europe. Elizabeth was steering England toward Protestantism. To Philip, she wasn't just a rival monarch. She was the one who had shattered the religious order he was sworn to protect. It wasn't only about faith. It was a struggle for dominance. Under Elizabeth, England was growing bolder. Ships explored new territories. Trade expanded. The navy strengthened. Figures like Francis Drake became symbols of England's rising confidence. That growth infuriated Spain, then one of the richest and most powerful empires on earth, backed by American gold and a fleet considered invincible. To most observers, tiny England stood no real chance. In 1588, the fear became reality. Hundreds of Spanish ships carrying soldiers and weapons advanced toward English shores with one clear goal: defeat Elizabeth, topple her government, and drag England back under Catholic rule. Up, rather than hide in her palace, Elizabeth did something almost no one expected. She rode out to meet her army. At Tilbury, standing before thousands of soldiers preparing for battle, she appeared not as a fragile monarch, but as a leader standing shoulder to shoulder with her people. She told them, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." It wasn't just a speech. It was the moment Elizabeth transformed herself into the living symbol of England. The battle that followed didn't unfold the way most predicted. English naval tactics brutal. Weather and a string of Spanish miscalculations forced the once unbeatable fleet into retreat. England had won, not through overwhelming strength, but through smarter, sharper strategy. The victory reshaped how the world saw England. A nation once dismissed as weak had proven it could stand against the greatest empire in Europe. And Elizabeth was no longer just a queen who had survived. She had become a symbol of resilience, a woman who turned doubt into power. But the Armada wasn't the only thing that made her a legend. One question followed her for her entire reign. Why would a young, powerful queen, pursued by suitors across Europe, choose never to marry at all? In the 16th century, a woman was rarely allowed to hold power alone, least of all a queen. The assumption was that she needed a man beside her, a husband, a king, someone to make the real decisions. Elizabeth refused that assumption entirely. She had no intention of standing behind a man. She intended to be the one making the decisions herself. From the moment she took the throne, one question dominated every conversation: when will the queen marry? Marriage wasn't romance, it was political currency. A royal union could forge alliances, secure armies, protect a crown. Suitors from across Europe lined up, powerful men eager to stand beside England's queen. Elizabeth kept every one of them at arm's length. The most talked about was Robert Dudley, a close friend since childhood. Many believed real affection existed between them. He understood her, and he was one of the few people she could speak to freely. But whatever personal feelings existed, Elizabeth never let them override the fate of her country. She understood the risk clearly. Marriage could cost her the one thing she valued most, her own authority. A foreign husband could demand power, shape English policy, and reduce her in the public eye to a king's wife, rather than a ruling monarch in her own right. Elizabeth had already lost too much in her life to hand her authority to someone else, so she built a different kind of image, declaring herself married to England. It remains one. She turned staying single from a liability into strength, convincing her people that her devotion belonged entirely to the nation, not to any husband or private family. It wasn't an easy path. Many feared that without an heir, England would fall into chaos after her death. That question haunted her entire reign, but Elizabeth held firm, believing a leader should be judged not by meeting others' expectations, but by what she actually built for her country. History proved her right. Across more than 40 years on the throne, England didn't collapse. It flourished. The arts exploded. Literature thrived. English explorers pushed outward into the world. This was the era that produced William Shakespeare, as England transformed from a minor kingdom into a rising global power. Behind the glittering reign, though, Elizabeth carried real loss. No family of her own, no children to carry her name forward. No ordinary life. She spent her entire reign choosing between personal happiness and the weight of the crown, and she chose the crown every time. That choice is exactly what made her extraordinary. She didn't become a great queen because she had everything. She became one because she sacrificed nearly everything. Most people spend their lives chasing love, family, a normal existence in exchange for something larger, a legacy. But every reign eventually ends. And after 4 decades on the throne with no child to succeed her, Elizabeth faced one final question. Who would carry her story forward? By the end of her reign, Elizabeth, I was no longer the uncertain young woman who'd inherited a divided kingdom. She had become a symbol, a woman who survived political conspiracies, defeated Europe's most powerful empire, and turned a fragile England into a far more confident nation. What made her extraordinary wasn't only her victories. It was how she redefined what power could look like. When Elizabeth first took the throne, many doubted a woman could lead a country at all. They expected failure. They believed England needed a stronger king. Elizabeth proved them wrong, not by imitating a man, but by ruling entirely on her own terms, through patience, intellect, and a rare understanding of human nature. One of her greatest achievements was holding England steady through one of the most turbulent periods in European history, constant wars and shifting alliances, and religious division everywhere. Elizabeth understood that a single rash decision could cost the entire kingdom dearly, so she chose careful, deliberate moves over quick victories. Sometimes a leader's greatest strength is knowing exactly when not to act. Her reign also became a golden age of English culture. Art, literature, and ideas flourished under her rule. This was the period that launched William Shakespeare into history, his work eventually becoming part of the fabric of world culture. Beyond the arts, England expanded its reach through exploration and trade, discovering new territories and steadily rising in global influence. Behind the powerful monarch, though, was still a person shaped by real pain. She had lost her mother as a child, lived through fear and suspicion, been imprisoned by her own sister. Those wounds never fully disappeared, but instead of letting them define her, Elizabeth turned them into strength. The girl once abandoned learned to stand on her own. The princess erased from the succession became the one who decided England's future. In 1603, after more than 4 decades on the throne, Elizabeth I died at the age of 69. She left no children, no royal family in the conventional sense, but she left something far greater, a legacy. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, opening a new chapter for England. Yet Elizabeth's name endured because she was never just a monarch. She was a symbol of resilience. The story of Elizabeth reminds us of something powerful. Sometimes the people most underestimated are the ones capable of building the most extraordinary legacies. A child who lost everything became a woman who held all the power. A girl once forgotten became a name history refuses to forget. And someone who once stood at the edge of death ultimately became the queen who changed England forever. This is a concise, emotionally rich version, perfectly suited to a cinematic storytelling style. And that is the story of Elizabeth I, a girl abandoned by her father, who lost her mother at the age of 2, who entered the Tower of London fearing she would never return. Yet this girl, once scorned by the world, became the queen who led England into its golden age. She proved that true strength doesn't come from bloodline, power, or brute force, but from intelligence, unwavering determination, and the ability to rise above adversity. Over 400 years have passed, and Elizabeth is remembered not only as a queen, but also as a symbol of willpower and resilience, because sometimes it is the people who are most underestimated who leave the greatest mark on history. Thank you for following Storyline History. See you in the next story.